This program was produced by Accuracy in Media, a media watchdog organization in Washington, D.C., representing the consumers of news.
This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It was erected in 1982 to honor the courage, sacrifice, and devotion to duty and country of its Vietnam veterans. Like the war itself, though, this belated tribute to our Vietnam veterans has been the subject of bitter controversy, even though it was intended to help heal the wounds still festering from the only war our country's ever lost. Were the more than 58,000 men whose names are chiseled into this marble sent to die on a fool's errand with no purpose? Or even worse, did they die in a misguided effort to block the legitimate aspirations of the Vietnamese people for national unity, as many critics of the war contended? Or were they engaged in a noble cause, an effort to halt the spread of communist tyranny? These are the questions that inflamed debate in this country throughout the 1960s and 70s. They were reignited by a widely shown television series, Vietnam, a Television History, first aired by the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, in the fall of 1983. It's been widely used in classrooms and has been rebroadcast by PBS. Unfortunately, Vietnam, a Television History, was flawed by serious errors and distortions. I'm Charlton Heston. I've always believed you have to understand history so you can plan for the future. The philosopher George Santayana said those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This program is dedicated to setting the historical record straight by correcting some of the more serious errors of the PBS series on Vietnam. Many experts are convinced that that series, Vietnam, a Television History, presented a distorted and inaccurate view of what the war was about, how it was fought, and why we lost it. Douglas Pike, director of the Indochina Archive at the University of California at Berkeley, was a consultant to the project. He believes that PBS did not live up to its declared goals.
In order to get the money from the National Endowment of Humanities, the producers had to submit a proposal. It's a very thick, long thing. And in one section, it lists the purposes or the accomplishments or the results that they, in effect, are promising will come out of this. One of them is that it would be a contribution to the record, that it would supply information of a historical record. What we get then, in terms of record, is a kind of episodic series of images. Some are accurate, some are inaccurate, some are significant, some are trivial. It's just a kind of kaleidoscope of images. The second one was it would serve historical contribution as an antidote to the misuses of history. And I consider this rather laughable. What it does is contribute to the misuses of history. Certainly doesn't clarify them in any way. And the third promise made by the producers is that this would contribute to the healing of national esteem. And the notion is it would develop a kind of pride in America and help end the trauma of the Vietnam experience. And this is the most flagrant violation of all, because it simply doesn't do this. It does not produce anything on the screen that an American could be proud of. And the fourth promise that what this series would do would be to contribute to historical methodology, the method of writing history. And it certainly doesn't do that except in a negative sense as to how not to do it. I mean, this series is many things, but it is not history-telling.
In the summer of 1984, a group of Vietnam experts assembled in Washington, D.C. to examine the shortcomings of Vietnam, a Television History. In his opening remarks to the Washington Conference, Reed Irvine, chairman of Accuracy in Media, said the PBS series had at least been correct in portraying the tragic consequences of the communist victory in Indochina.
It tells us that in Cambodia, perhaps a third of the entire population of that country perished in the 3.5-year rule of the murderous Pol Pot. It tells us of the repression and misery that caused an estimated 2 million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians to flee their countries at the risk of their lives, a tragic exodus unprecedented in the history of these lands.
Unfortunately, the PBS series doesn't show the connection between these horrendous events and their cause, namely the imposition of communist rule over all of Indochina. Now, there were people that were genuinely surprised when the communist Pol Pot took over Cambodia and began the extermination of all educated Cambodians. Even the New York Times ran a story on April 13, 1975, which was headlined, "Indochina Without Americans, For Most a Better Life." And that was datelined Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I'm sure the author really believed that. But by the time the PBS series was made, there was no excuse for that kind of naivete. We already knew that Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh had not been fighting for democracy and for freedom in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. But the producers of the PBS series went through the whole series as though they didn't know this, as though this was something that they discovered only when they came to the 13th program at the very end. Now, one of the great advantages of history is that you can take advantage of 20/20 hindsight. They didn't do that. They didn't write this series as though they had any understanding of what had happened until the very end program. And as a result, they failed to put across one of the most important lessons that should be learned from the Vietnam experience, and that is that the imposition of communist rule inevitably results in great human tragedy.
Stephen Morris is an Australian scholar with the Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of California in Berkeley. He says that the basic underlying myth of the PBS series is that the communists aren't really communists at all. They're just nationalists.
This is an important question, whether Ho Chi Minh was primarily a nationalist or primarily a communist. If he was primarily a communist, as I've argued, this means that he did constitute a security threat to the United States and the free world because of his commitment to the internationalist communist community led by the Soviet Union. The second reason is, if we recognize the fact that he was primarily a communist, we understand why his victory constituted a great setback for the cause of human rights in his own part of the world. Because as a communist, he felt it necessary to use massive violence against non-communists who might potentially threaten his power.
Dolph Droege was a member of the National Security Council from 1967 to 1973. During that time, he took part in a number of debates and teach-ins. He was appalled then, and he still is, by the general ignorance of Ho's dedication to the communist cause and his betrayal for profit of true Vietnamese nationalists.
In 1920, Ho Chi Minh, under the name then of Nguyen Ai Quoc, found the path that he stayed faithful to for the rest of his life. He became a French communist, a founding or early member of the French Communist Party in 1920, and on a grant went to Moscow to study at the Toilers of the East School, the Lenin Institute in Moscow. There he became a Soviet citizen and took out a Soviet passport. He graduates from that school in 1926 and goes to China. He's on the staff of the Russian consulate, the Soviet consulate in Canton, China. And he works for Borodin, the famous consul. And he's an international communist organizer. And he brings Vietnamese to China to study revolution. And as they come to study, he supports them as long as he sees that they are open to a communist result of their studies. When they show that they'll cling to their nationalist beliefs, he then sees to it that they are betrayed to the French police back in Vietnam as they re-enter Vietnam. And so this trail even leads him in 1926 to invite his oldest teacher and counselor, the George Washington of the Vietnamese nationalist movement of those days, Phan Boi Chau. He invited Phan Boi Chau to Shanghai to talk about revolution. And he betrayed him to the French security police there in Shanghai for gold. And he used the money to finance a Vietnamese communist movement in China. And that movement, in its first protest in the streets, protested, "We object to the inhuman French arrest of Fan Boi Chao. So you know you're dealing with a pro, a real professional international communist.
Dolph Droge analyzes the way in which PBS glossed over this negative side of Ho Chi Minh's career.
In the second episode of the PBS series, they make the statement that Ho, when he came to power in 1945, was known by Vietnamese as a patriot for about a quarter of a century. And of course, that's so totally wrong, because Ho only took the name Ho Chi Minh in 1941 inside a Chinese prison, and Vietnamese would not have a knowledge of that. But in 1944, he came out of the prison in China, and he came in contact with the United States intelligence agents there, OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and they wanted him to help organize escape nets for Allied pilots down in North Vietnam fighting the Japanese. And so that was where he first came to Vietnamese in 1944 and said, I'm Ho Chi Minh, and I'm organizing these efforts and the resistance against the Japanese and the resistance against the French. And they would only have had 1 year to get to know him, and then he would suddenly be standing on a platform saying to them, I am now leading this new government. And everyone would be saying, who is this man? Now, that would not be difficult for PBS to find out when that historical record is so clear.
Contrary to all existing histories in the subject, even histories written by communist authors, PBS associated Ho with the Yen Bai Rebellion of February 1930.
The leaders of that revolt became martyrs when they were executed by the French. They headed a non-communist nationalist party known by the acronym VQDD. Yet the PBS account of the revolt was introduced with this statement.
He was not in Vietnam, but his ideas and the Vietnamese he trained were. In 1930, new rebellions broke out.
Vietnamese, both in this country and abroad, were so outraged that they demonstrated.
Well, the demonstration in this country then started in New Orleans. And the first night, it was a Sunday night. There's about 1,000 Vietnamese who turned out to demonstrate against the PBS series. And, but the people were still unhappy about it, so they wanted to demonstrate some more. So the following Tuesday, it was only 2 days later, it was working days. There's very hardly any time for telling people, and yet a crowd of something like 1,500 people turned out. And both Vietnamese and Americans, regular people, women, children, old people, veterans, not just the so-called militant people. The second one was the demonstration in Houston against KUHT, I think is the name of the station, Channel 8 down in Houston. Then the one in San Diego happens. Then the one here against WETA in Washington, D.C. Now, this doesn't include the demonstration against the PBS series in London and also in Paris.
When the series was rebroadcast in the summer of 1984, some of the wording was changed to give credit for the Yen Bai Rebellion where it belongs, to the Nationalist Party, not to Ho and the Communists. Still, there was no public announcement of these changes, and no recall of the many videotapes that still contain this
Historical error. An error as absurd as saying that the communists were behind our Boston Tea Party. Communists have been successful over the years in passing themselves off as nationalists and patriots. We saw this in Cuba with Castro and in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas. When it becomes clear that these people are communists, then the explanation is that these revolutionaries were forced to turn to Moscow when the United States refused to give them aid.
In the PBS series, a former OSS officer named Archimedes Patty performs this function when he explains how we muffed our chance to make an ally of Ho Chi Minh.
Ho Chi Minh was on a silver platter in 1945. We had him. He was leaning not towards the Soviet Union, which at the time he told me that the USSR could not assist him because they had just won a war only by dint of real heroism, and they were in no position to help anyone. So really, we had Ho Chi Minh, we had the Viet Minh, we had the Indochina question in our hand.
When Ho Chi Minh had established himself in power in Hanoi in 1945, he invited Archimedes Patty and other OSS people to accompany him to various public ceremonies which were being held in the capital city. And Patty went along with that. Whether he realized it or not, what he was doing was making the Vietnamese people believe that the United States was backing Ho Chi Minh.
William Stearman's a professor of international relations at Georgetown University. He agrees that Patty, who was only 24 when he met Ho, was badly fooled by him.
This is one of the principal rationales against our involvement in Vietnam. Ho was a nationalist. He simply wanted freedom, quote unquote, and independence for Vietnam, freedom from colonial power and influence, first against the French and what the communists would call neo-colonialist influence of the United States. Later, Ho himself would have been absolutely appalled had he been called a national communist by any other communist. I mean, he was one of the last of the old international communists. Firmly believed in the solidarity of the world communist movement, and so said in his last testament, which was published just after his death in September 1969, where he appealed to the Soviet Union and China to heal their differences and reestablish the unity of the world communist movement.
Having portrayed the communists as principled nationalists fighting for the independence and unity of Vietnam, the PBS series shows the South Vietnamese as the bad guys. The story becomes a melodrama, white hats versus black hats. Our friends are the ones in the black hats. The title of the third episode is America's Mandarin. The hour segment attempts to convey the two negative messages implied by this title. First, it tells us that Nguyen Dinh Diem was an American puppet, which he certainly was not. Second, the word Mandarin suggests elitism, selfish privilege, ideas that are guaranteed to alienate American viewers. People who saw the series will recall that Ho was never called a Soviet puppet. He was never portrayed as an autocrat. The way in which the series introduces Prime Minister Diem undermines his authenticity as a national leader. He's shown arriving at Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, where he's welcomed by President Eisenhower. The message is that Diem, the puppet, has come to Washington to see the man who pulls the strings. Later in this episode, America's Mandarin, Diem is described as a little-known nationalist. Little known to whom? General Edward G. Lansdale was in Saigon when Diem's appointment as prime minister was announced. He has a different memory of the new leader's stature among Vietnamese.
I was in Vietnam in 1954 when Ngo Dinh Diem was appointed as prime minister. And before he got there, Ambassador Donald Heath, the American ambassador, asked me to go on and check with the Vietnamese I knew and find out some things about Diem. So I started talking to them about him and discovered he was very well known by them. Everyone that I talked to felt that he was an exceptionally honest person. He had a very strong character, and most of them felt that he was perhaps one of the best known of the living nationalists left in the country, and was much more favorably known than Ho Chi Minh was by most of the people in South Vietnam.
As a part of the Geneva Agreement of 1954, Vietnam was divided into two parts along the 17th parallel. It was agreed that the French would pull out and that the Viet Minh forces would go north, leaving the South to develop its own democratic institutions. During a specified period, people were allowed to choose in which of the two parts of the country they would live.
Dù đường thiêng
Over 1 million people flocked to the democratic southern half of the country. Most, but not all, were Catholics. A lot of them were running from the violence of Ho Chi Minh's oppressive regime.
Violence was central to the success of the communists in Vietnam. Back in 1945, in the scenes which we see in the PBS series, there is no mention of the fact that the communists carried out a massive campaign of assassination of all non-communist nationalist leaders they could get their hands on, including even Marxists who they disagreed with, those followers of Leon Trotsky. They were simply murdered, one after the other, over a period of 6 months to a year. It's believed that some 10,000 people were killed in these 12 months. I think those who are concerned with human rights would consider that a very significant statistical fact. Not only the assassinations of 1945-46 are not mentioned. The assassinations, the murders which took place in the late 40s of other non-communist nationalists, the Hoa Hao and the Cao Dai. They were very important in the communist consolidation of their position and domination of the nationalist movement, because the Hoa Hao and the Cao Dai were Vietnamese nationalists who were independent of the communists. Once again, Ho Chi Minh could not accept anybody being independent of him and his organization. So murders took place on a large scale there. Thirdly, a very important historical case is the case of the Catholics of North Vietnam. Most people know the Northern Catholics as being the core of the people who fled from North Vietnam to South Vietnam in 1955 after the Geneva Agreements. But most people don't understand why those Catholics fled from North to South. It wasn't because of any religious doctrine which had told them that they had to fear the communists. It wasn't because, as the PBS series suggests, most of them had collaborated with the French, although some of them had. Nor was it because, as the PBS series unfairly suggests, because the Catholics had been incited by CIA black propaganda to be fearful of the communist takeover when they didn't really need to be. No, there was a very practical experience they'd had which caused them to flee, and that is that in 1950, the communists led by Ho Chi Minh launched an unprovoked military attack against them, in spite of the fact that the Catholics of North Vietnam were fighting against the French in alliance with, but independently of, the communists.
The PBS series gives the impression that Diem lacked legitimacy because he refused to hold the elections that were provided for in the 1954 Geneva Agreements.
Denied the election promised at Geneva and nearly destroyed by Diem and News police, the communist leadership and its southern supporters decided to go back to war.
Dr. Bruce Loebs, a student of the Geneva Agreement, is highly critical of this interpretation.
Now, every myth has to have a hero, and the hero in the PBS series is clearly Ho Chi Minh, but he needs to be constructed as a hero. Every myth has to have a villain. The villain in the PBS piece, of course, is South Vietnam and the United States. Now, to make Ho Chi Minh the hero, it is necessary to make him the legitimate ruler of all of Vietnam. And they do this by distorting the so-called elections that were supposed to be held in 1956, according to the Geneva Accords. In 11 specific instances, the PBS series tells the viewer that the United States and South Vietnam reneged on elections as they were supposed to be held according to the Geneva Conference. This elections issue is the single most discussed topic in the PBS series. Now, they do this for one main reason. They want to legitimize, or at least rationalize, Ho Chi Minh's aggression against South Vietnam. If South Vietnam is not a country, because it wasn't supposed to be because of the elections, and if Ho Chi Minh is simply conquering his own country, then Ho Chi Minh can become a legitimate hero. No elections were promised at Geneva. What the PBS series omits is a clear statement by our ambassador to the Geneva Conference, our observer, Walter Bedell Smith, that the United States is not bound by the Geneva Accords, that with specific reference to elections, as expressed in the Article 7 of the final declaration, the United States opposes elections unless they are supervised by the United Nations to make sure they are free. The PBS series makes no mention of Bedell Smith's qualification about elections, nor does the PBS series mention that on July 21st, 1954, President Eisenhower in a press conference explicitly stated that the United States was not a party to and is not bound by the decisions taken in the Geneva Conference.
As Dr. Lobes has pointed out, the storyline of the series required that the National Liberation Front appear as a popular movement springing out of the ordinary citizen's hatred of Diem and his policies. Douglas Pike's search of the NLF's public record reveals more contrived origins.
The NLF was not a coalition of Southern political forces against Zim. It was an organizational weapon forged by Hanoi for one purpose: to unify North and South Vietnam under its banner. The NLF's formation in 1960 had no particular connection with the Geneva Conference. It had everything to do with Hanoi's strategic thinking. Hanoi basic doctrine, then and later, was what is called the strategy of Dao Chan, or struggle. There are two forms of Dao Chan. First, political struggle, which is not politics as we think of it, but that gray area between war and politics, what might be called politics with guns. Second kind of Dao Chan is armed struggle, which is warfare more or less as we think of it, usually by guerrilla or sometimes by regular forces. Although it does involve other activities such as assassinations and kidnappings that are not normally associated with organized military forces. In 1959 came the switch to armed struggle. The NLF, or Viet Cong, was the instrument for this. Now, all of this is bedrock history, was bedrock history at the time, although at the time it was denied by Hanoi. No longer is this true. Hanoi historians now boast of the entire implementation of the strategy.
Former Ambassador Elbridge Durbro notes that the PBS producers knew these facts, but chose to leave them out of their television history.
For a long time, while I was out there from 57 to 61, we knew that Hanoi was supplying the Viet Cong in the South various means. They're putting more and more men and supplies down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which had been opened during the French period as well. They revitalized it. They were pouring supplies down there in 1960, 61, and on. And our air attaché had heard about this thing. He flew up there and took pictures of it in December 1960. We had good documentary pictures several times of this thing. We told that to the PBS interviewers when I was interviewed at my house some years before, and they didn't use a line of it.
The inaccurate political history in the PBS series and their demeaning portrayal of Prime Minister Diem are only part of their unfair depiction of the South.
The basic struggle, which was between the nationalists and the communists, which I think that everybody knows, here is all jumbled together. But I think it's also a double standard that we see here, so that the Northern Vietnamese are always portrayed as saints, as revolutionary, as being very dedicated, and the South Vietnamese as being rather passive, puppets, corrupted, and things like that. Now, what this doesn't explain at all is that if such was the case, why it took more than 30 years for the North Vietnamese to defeat the South Vietnamese?
Scholar Douglas Pike felt that the distortion went beyond error, beyond unfairness.
But I thought their treatment of the South Vietnamese was even worse than that. I thought it was a contempt. It was a kind of almost racist kind of non-people. They never had one single kind word, really, for the South Vietnamese. They regarded them sort of as non-people, It was America's Enemy, for example, was the title of segment 106, not the Vietnamese and American enemy, but just American enemy. The 1973 Paris ceasefire agreement, the narrator tells us America brought in the South Vietnamese, as though they didn't have a legitimate voice. They weren't involved, really. We just brought them in as an adjunct. It's just a kind of contempt for South Vietnamese, of vilifying the government and the society, just slandering the South Vietnamese armed forces. I mean, not even a hint of sympathy or empathy for it. This, of course, is what has enraged the South Vietnamese of this country, whatever their political beliefs, and believe me, there's a wide political spectrum among them in this country, but they seem united in this feeling that it's a kind of a palpable kind of contempt for South Vietnam.
Through all this PBS melodrama of heroes and villains, there's no hint that two ways of life, one based on freedom, the other on communism, were struggling for the future of Indochina. The same tar brush the PBS series used on our lives paints a pretty dark picture of the American military in Vietnam. The men who fought there aren't very happy about that. Captain John McCain, now a U.S. congressman from Arizona, was a Navy flyer who was shot down and spent 6 years in a North Vietnamese prison camp.
The PBS series established, I think, a very unfortunate juxtaposition between the treatment of the American POWs in North Vietnam and the treatment by the Vietnamese and or the Americans of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese prisoners. Because I think there's a dramatic difference. Indeed, there were tragic situations of brutality inflicted by both the South Vietnamese and American soldiers on prisoners. That is a tragedy of every war that's ever taken place in history. But they were isolated, unfortunate incidents that took place in the field. There is not one single documented case of mistreatment of a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese prisoner once they were in the prison compound. The North Vietnamese, on the other hand, had a calculated program of mistreatment, psychological and physical, in order to exploit the POWs for propaganda purposes. I think there's a great difference. I don't think that difference was drawn, and I think it needs to be in fairness to the American government and the then South Vietnamese government. In relation to PBS, I think that it was unfortunate that this series did not give the attention it deserved of the way that the Vietnamese manipulated the American POWs for propaganda purposes. The Vietnamese captured Americans for one reason and one reason alone, to use for propaganda purposes, which would then help them to negotiate in the kind of agreement they wanted with the Americans so that they could win a victory in Indochina, including Laos and Cambodia, which they did. People like Ramsey Clark, Jane Fonda, and others who came to Hanoi, met with the same 7 POWs, came back and told what can only be described as falsehoods about the American POWs and their conditions, did a great disservice to America and our efforts in Indochina. And did a great service to the Vietnamese in their efforts to win, because Ho Chi Minh in 1965 said, "We won't win the war in the battlefields of Indochina. We'll win the war in the streets of San Francisco, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C." They helped him do that.
I think the great unjustness of this film is that it portrays the American soldier in Vietnam as a drug addict, a racial bigot, and a man who murdered his officers and NCOs almost at will. the hundreds of thousands of Americans who went to Vietnam and served honorably and bravely have got to be incensed at this terrible, terrible misrepresentation of their bravery and sacrifice on the battlefield.
Based on his experience at many levels of command, Kenneth Moorfield faults the series for misrepresenting the American soldier's performance under the stress of an unconventional war.
I think that you could have selected an equal number of soldiers who fought in many successful battles using tactics that were eminently worthy against the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. The distinct impression I had from the series was that the American fighting man and the American Army or armed services were not the equal of their adversary. The quality of the American fighting man in Vietnam was as high or higher as we've had serving on our behalf in any previous war. Now, I can say as a former company commander there that I couldn't have received more support from my men. I think they were fantastic. They were brave, they were young, they showed initiative, courage, every quality you could possibly hope to have from a soldier in combat. And they died. And they died with dignity and honor, from my point of view.
PBS calls episode 13 Legacies. It gives a grim portrait of the post-war life of our Vietnam veterans. Here's one of their more objectionable observations.
Of 2.5 million who served in Southeast Asia, a substantial number, some estimate 750,000, are still haunted by the experience.
William Jane, a Vietnam veteran who became director of Action's Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program, reports that his daily contact with veterans refutes these statistics.
The PBS program, especially episode 13, Legacy, does not talk in any great detail about veterans, who they are and their problems today. It seems that the image of the veteran is very much the stereotyped image of the veteran as a loser, victim. The word they use is haunted. PBS didn't give the other side of the picture, which is that veterans are not only well-adjusted by and large and productive members of society, but that many veterans are now assuming leadership roles in the society, and that their leadership is, their success in life so far has been achieved, and many of them say, in part because of their experience of having served their country, not in spite of it.
It's pretty difficult to reconcile the difference between what the PBS series says about the Vietnam veteran and the testimony of Dan Cragg, Kenneth Moorfield, and William Jane. Colonel Harry Summers is the author of the bestseller On Strategy. It's one of the best works of history I've read recently. Colonel Summers is also a Vietnam veteran and a decorated career officer. He has some comments.
But in my dealings with the media and with the Vietnam Veterans Program especially, and also some conversations on college campuses at the height of the Vietnam War, it was obvious that the people who were protesting the war desperately needed a moral justification for what they were doing. As time passes, as now it is no longer fashionable to say that you ran off to Canada, or that you deliberately starved yourself, or that you deliberately missed the draft, as Christopher Buckley's piece in Esquire is testimony of that. James Fowler's piece in the Washington Monthly, again, testimony of that. These people are having second thoughts, and now they have to justify what they did, otherwise they're going to be held up to criticism. And as the newer works come out, they're going to be even more objective, so that the people who avoided the war, who deliberately avoided the war, have a need to freeze history in place at the period of the 69-70 period where they were in the moral ascendancy.
Popular support for our troops was never as newsworthy as demonstrations against the war. For example, on May 13th, 1967, the third longest parade in U.S. history was held on New York City's Fifth Avenue. 250,000 people marched for 9 hours in the Support Our Men in Vietnam parade. This massive display, one of many by ordinary Americans, was glossed over by the media. PBS repeats this journalistic oversight by showing a minor side event on the same day, a parachute drop of a couple of men. Like the press of the period, PBS does not explain that on that same afternoon, only 200 yards away, tens of thousands of New Yorkers massed for what has been labeled by media critics as the parade that never was. This kind of distorted coverage had a cumulative effect on Congress. The results in the battlefield were disastrous. Many people believed that the Case Church Amendment, which was passed in February of 1973, spelled doom for South Vietnam. As of January 1973, we had won the war in the sense that we were in a position to preserve the independence of South Vietnam, free of communist control, without further significant risk of American lives. Senator Steve Sims of Idaho tells how the Case Church Amendment then threw away any possibility of victory.
The Case Church Amendment stated that there could clearly, unequivocally in the law, said that there could be no American combat activity in or over Southeast Asia. And that was like sending a telegraph to the North Vietnamese that we were not going to enforce the Paris Peace Accords. When President Nixon engaged in the Paris Peace Accords and agreed to sign those accords, the understanding always was that we would enforce any violations of the treaty with American air power. Then Congress legislated that away from the presidency, took that power back into the Congress. That was an open invitation for the North Vietnamese to try a repeat of their failed offensive that they did, if you recall, in Easter Offense in 1972. In addition to Case Church, then Congress started cutting the ammunition allocation. And so they literally left them without air power, air cover, and then reduced their tactical logistics supplies. It's just a tragic story in history. And we are now paying for that very dearly.
It's clear the people paying most dearly are the Cambodians, the Laotians, and the Vietnamese. They've lost their countries. After 12 hours of film which presented the communists as principled idealists, PBS finds in its final episode that once installed, the Marxist utopia violates the human rights of its citizens. There are interviews with Cambodian refugees and boat people in this segment, but their message is muted by including more statements by Vietnamese communists. The viewer is left with the impression that the Indo-Chinese Holocaust could be viewed from two equally valid perspectives. The basic truth that's overlooked in this balanced perspective is that the mass flight of refugees was a unique event in thousands of years of Indo-Chinese history.
It's very much similar to what happens during the Second World War when there's a whole population of Jewish people who had to run away for their lives. As simple as that. Now, another friend of mine, Li Tong, now he fled by running, bicycling, getting hitchhiked and things like that, from Vietnam through Cambodia, through Thailand, through Malaysia, into Singapore. So something like about 6 countries just mostly walking. But the communists came. Over 1 million Vietnamese have left our land, despite our great longing for being where our relatives, friends, and families are.
The poem A Prayer for Land speaks of the agony of this exodus of principle. Lost in the tempests, out in the open seas, our small boats drift. We seek for land during the endless days and endless nights.
Giữa đại dương, quyết tâm tìm đất sống, đói lạnh bao ngày đường. Chúng tôi là bọt biển, trôi dạt giữa mênh mông. Chúng tôi là hạt bụi.
We are the foam floating on the ocean. We are the dust wandering in endless space. Our cries are lost in the howling wind.
Trong không gian vô cùng, tiếng chúng tôi lạc mất trong gió rít từng không. trên thuyền không nước uống, trên thuyền hết thức ăn, con chúng tôi kiệt sức, khóc rã và liệm.
Without food, without water, our children lie exhausted until they cry no more. Kenneth Moorfield recently produced a documentary to help Americans understand the pain of removal.
There's an incredible cost involved in our defeat, if you will, and our failure to continue to pursue the war in Vietnam. I think that you can see that cost in the eyes of these thousands of people that are forced to flee their societies, and the hopelessness that they feel initially, having left their land. I think that hopelessness can be traced to our failure to fulfill the designs, the goals, the objectives of our policy. I think it was a noble policy, a noble commitment. We were trying to preserve for them the option of their own way of life, of their own culture. And to me, that human cost, the human dimensions of that tragedy are something that I believe that we must continue to come to terms with.
There were men who understood very well that Ho Chi Minh was a communist with plans for all of Indochina. They warned Americans of the suffering that was ahead. That suffering is the true legacy of Vietnam.
We did the right thing in our national interest. Certainly from a moral point of view, what we were trying to prevent came to pass, and the results were horrendous for the people of Indochina. I don't have to go into details. Everybody's aware of the hundreds of thousands of boat people who have lost their lives fleeing from Vietnam, from the oppression. Tens of thousands of the people are still in concentration camps in Vietnam. The millions that were killed in probably the worst example of genocide in modern history in proportion to the population. Certainly the Holocaust was, in terms of absolute numbers, was greater, but in terms of the numbers of people affected, this was the worst example of genocide probably in history. And that was the sort of thing we were fighting to prevent. And lots of us predicted that, and we were laughed at by those who opposed our involvement in the war.
And if the series teaches its lessons well, Congressman John McCain's concerned about America's repeating the errors which led to the Vietnam debacle.
The legacy of Vietnam is with us today. I see it in the halls of Congress. I hear it on the floor in the speeches and the statements that are made. The reluctance of the United States to understand that we have vital national security interests throughout the world, and we have an obligation not just to maintain the freedom of people in the world, but to maintain our vital national security interests. The situation in Central America, in my opinion, is far graver than that in Indochina, geography being one of the primary reasons.
This is a war of geopolitical objectives.
Unless we learn that we have got to give the kind of military and economic aid to the government of El Salvador that's necessary for them to survive, we may be paying again with American lives in a far more serious situation closer to the United States than El Salvador is.
Senator Sims warns that this time a repetition of our Vietnam errors would have dire consequences for the United States.
Is that we have the same kind of a struggle taking place now in Central America. And the American people are getting a misinformation and a misbelief that the polls support this, that somehow the government that we're supporting in El Salvador is corrupt and a dictatorship and doesn't recognize human rights. Same thing exactly as what they all told us about South Vietnam. If the United States fails to meet its obligations in Central America, we will in fact, have probably somewhere between 10 and 20 million refugees pouring across our borders from Mexico very rapidly. Because this war that's going on in Central America, the target is Mexico. The target is not El Salvador. That's where the Soviets are trying to aim their arrow.
Behind locked doors, never to cast a ballot. It's been said that guerrillas control one.
Ahí cuando el avión pasó, tiró todas las bombas ahí y mataron a toda la gente y así quedó todo el pueblo destruido.
So it's critical to our future security. And if we Americans fail to answer that call now to face our responsibilities, we will really have to pay for it.
Robert Elegant wrote a very important article for the British journal Encounter. He said, for the first time in history, the outcome of a war was determined not on the battlefield, but on the printed page, and above all, on the television screen. We have to understand how the media shape what we think.
Well, James Heston was actually the first big-name journalist in this country who gave the media, the reporters and the cameras, credit for bringing about our defeat in Vietnam. And he was proud of the fact when he wrote in April 1975. One of the great lessons of the Vietnam War was that the enemy was able to use our free, uncontrolled media to achieve their own objectives. And yet, that important lesson was totally ignored by the PBS series. Now, I'm going to give you just one example. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a turning point in the war. It was portrayed by our media as a defeat for our side, even though it was actually a very outstanding military victory. The Viet Cong suffered horrendous losses from which they never really fully recovered. They were beaten back in every case. In the fall of 1968, a producer at NBC News named Jack Fern recognized that they had gotten the story wrong in portraying it as a defeat. And he proposed to Robert Northshield, the senior producer, that they do a series to set the record straight. Northshield, after a little thought, turned the idea down. And he later on explained why. He said that Tet had been established in the public mind as a defeat. And therefore, it was an American defeat. Now think about that. For the first time in our history, a victory that our men had won on the field of battle was transmuted into a defeat by our own news media.
No, the men whose names are chiseled into this marble were not sent on a fool's errand with no purpose. The purpose was noble, but we failed. Our people and our leaders became confused and suffered a loss of will with disastrous consequences. But perhaps these brave men will not have died in vain if we distill from that experience the real lessons of Vietnam. We were right to resist communist aggression. We were wrong to think the outcome would be decided by military strength. In the end, words, disinformation, deception were the deciding factors in the Vietnam War.
Indeed, these media-related issues need a special program of their own where the power of the television image and the impact of media in general can be explored in detail. We won't be truly responsible citizens until we confront these challenges of our information age.
I'm Charlton Heston.
A book-length study of the PBS series is James Benarian's Losers Are Pirates, a close look at the PBS series Vietnam, A Television History. Special thanks to a group of Vietnamese youth concerned with preserving the truth of Vietnamese history for bringing this source and others to our attention. This program was produced by Accuracy in Media, Incorporated, which is solely responsible for its content. This program was funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Henry Salvatore, Peter C. Cook, Bishop and Mrs. Willard D. Pendleton, Wilson C. Lucum, Dell and Elizabeth Ankers, and over 2,700 individuals. For more information about AIM books, newsletters, and media-on-media productions, write to Accuracy in Media, 1275 K Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20005, or call Accuracy in Media at 202-371-6710. Criticisms and suggestions are always welcome.